The day I signed the paperwork for 6,000 acres of land, I honestly thought I was making the safest investment of my life. For years I had dreamed about owning a large piece of property somewhere away from crowded cities' noisy traffic and endless regulations. I wanted space. I wanted freedom. Most importantly, I wanted land that nobody could tell me how to use. When my real estate agent first showed me the property, it felt almost unreal. Endless green fields stretched across the horizon. A winding creek cut through the landscape like a silver ribbon reflecting the afternoon sunlight. There were old oak trees scattered throughout the property, and a peaceful silence that made the entire place feel untouched. The previous owner had held the land in his family for nearly 80 years. According to him, nobody had ever seriously developed it. The acreage remained mostly farmland and open pasture. Standing there that day, I felt like I had finally escaped the constant restrictions of modern life. What I didn't know was that one small wooden bridge hidden near the edge of the property was about to drag me into one of the strangest battles I had ever experienced. Over the next several days, I began exploring every corner of the property. 6,000 acres sounds large when you hear the number, but walking through it in person is an entirely different experience. There were sections of forest I hadn't reached yet. Old fence lines disappeared into the distance. Several abandoned structures sat hidden among clusters of trees. Every day seemed to reveal something new. One afternoon I drove my ATV toward the northern section of the property where the creek widened significantly. That was when I first saw the bridge. At first glance it looked completely ordinary. The structure was old but surprisingly well maintained. Wooden support beams stretched across the water while steel reinforcements had clearly been added years ago. What caught my attention wasn't the bridge itself. It was the traffic. Vehicle after vehicle crossed it every few minutes. Luxury SUVs, pickup trucks, delivery vans, school buses. Everyone seemed to be using that bridge. I remember thinking it was strange because the bridge sat deep inside land that now belonged to me. Curiosity got the better of me. The following day I decided to sit near the bridge and simply watch. Within 30 minutes I noticed a pattern. Every vehicle crossing the bridge seemed to be heading toward the same location. Across the creek sat a large upscale neighborhood. The entrance featured decorative stone walls, expensive landscaping, and a large community sign positioned beside a security gate. It was obvious this wasn't an ordinary subdivision. This was an HOA community. The homes were enormous. Perfect lawns stretched across every property. Not a single blade of grass appeared out of place. The entire neighborhood looked like something out of a luxury real estate commercial. As I continued watching traffic move across the bridge, I realized something surprising. Without that bridge, residents would have to drive nearly 20 additional miles to reach the nearest highway. The bridge wasn't just convenient. It was essential. And every single resident depended on it, whether they realized it or not. A few days later, I finally began reviewing the paperwork that came with the property. The seller had given me several large boxes filled with surveys, maps, permits, and legal records accumulated over decades. Most buyers probably would have ignored them. I didn't. My father always taught me that the most valuable information about land is usually hidden inside old documents. Late one evening I spread dozens of maps across my dining room table. For hours I studied property boundaries, easements, utility routes, and historical surveys. Then I found something interesting. One particular survey showed the bridge. A thick red boundary line surrounded it. The line matched the exact property borders I had purchased. I checked the document again. Then again. And again. The bridge wasn't outside my land. The bridge wasn't adjacent to my land. According to the survey, the bridge sat entirely within my property boundaries. At first I assumed there had to be some mistake. Surely an entire neighborhood couldn't be relying on a bridge owned by a private landowner. The situation sounded absurd. The next morning I drove to the county records office hoping to clear up the confusion. I expected a simple explanation. Maybe the bridge belonged to the county. Maybe an easement existed that wasn't shown on the survey. Maybe ownership had transferred years ago. Instead, the clerk spent nearly an hour reviewing archived records before finally looking up from her computer screen. Her expression told me everything. She seemed genuinely surprised. Then she said something that would completely change the course of the story. "Sir, according to every record we have, that bridge belongs to you." For several seconds I honestly thought she was joking. Unfortunately, she wasn't. 3 days after my visit to the county records office, I received an unexpected visitor. I was repairing a fence line near one of the pastures when a black luxury SUV turned into my driveway. The vehicle looked completely out of place among the tractor's livestock trailers and farm equipment scattered around the property. The SUV stopped and a woman stepped out wearing a bright pink business suit. She walked toward me with the confidence of someone who was used to giving orders and rarely hearing the word no. Before introducing herself, she glanced around my property as if she were conducting an inspection. Her eyes moved from my barn to a parked tractor and then toward a stack of lumber near one of the sheds. I immediately had a feeling this wasn't going to be a friendly conversation. When she finally spoke, her tone confirmed my suspicion. "Hello? I'm Linda Parker, president of the Willow Creek Estates Homeowners Association." At that moment, I had no idea this woman was about to become the center of a battle that would last for months. At first, the conversation seemed polite enough. She congratulated me on purchasing the property and welcomed me to the area. But within less than a minute, the discussion changed direction. Instead of asking about my plans for the land, she began listing concerns from HOA residents. Apparently, several homeowners were unhappy about seeing farm equipment from certain parts of the neighborhood. Others complained about the appearance of my barns. One resident reportedly disliked the sound of tractors operating early in the morning. I remember standing there wondering if she had somehow forgotten a very important fact. My property wasn't inside her HOA. I hadn't signed any HOA agreement. I wasn't one of her residents. Yet she spoke as if she expected me to follow the association's rules. The more she talked, the stranger the conversation became. Then came the request that truly caught me off guard. Linda explained that the HOA board had been discussing the bridge for quite some time. According to her, several residents felt the structure needed cosmetic improvements. Fresh paint, new railings, updated lighting, landscaping around the entrance. As she listed the upgrades, I assumed she was describing a future HOA project. Then she looked directly at me and said something unexpected. "We would like you to handle those improvements as soon as possible." For a moment, I honestly thought I had misunderstood her. The estimated cost of the work she described could easily reach tens of thousands of dollars. And yet she was speaking as though paying for it should be my responsibility alone. Trying to remain polite, I asked a simple question. "Will the HOA be contributing to those costs?" The answer arrived instantly. No. There wasn't even a moment of hesitation. According to Linda, the bridge benefited my property because it increased accessibility. Therefore, maintenance should remain entirely my responsibility. The logic made absolutely no sense. Hundreds of HOA residents crossed the bridge every day. Delivery trucks used it. School buses used it. Emergency vehicles used it. In reality, the people benefiting most from the bridge weren't on my land at all. They were inside the HOA community. Yet somehow the association believed I should cover every expense while they enjoyed unlimited access. The conversation was beginning to reveal exactly how entitled the board had become. After nearly 30 minutes, Linda finally returned to her SUV and left. But before driving away, she delivered one final warning. She claimed HOA residents expected certain standards from neighboring properties. If those standards weren't met, the board would explore additional options. The statement sounded less like advice and more like a threat. That evening, I sat alone in my farmhouse office reviewing everything I had learned so far. The bridge belonged to me. The HOA relied on it. And now the association president was attempting to pressure me into spending money for the benefit of her residents. Something about the entire situation felt wrong. The more I thought about it, the more convinced I became that there was a much bigger story hidden beneath the surface. And I was determined to uncover it. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual with one goal in mind. If the HOA president was confident enough to make demands about a bridge she didn't own, then I wanted to understand exactly why. I loaded every survey map, deed, and ownership record into my truck and drove back to the county records office. This time I wasn't looking for basic information. I wanted history. The county clerk recognized me immediately. When I explained what had happened during my conversation with the HOA president, her eyebrows lifted slightly. Apparently, I wasn't the first person to have problems with Willow Creek Estates. For nearly 3 hours we reviewed archived property documents dating back decades. The deeper we dug, the stranger things became. The bridge had originally been built by the family who owned my land almost 50 years earlier. Back then there was no HOA community. No luxury homes. No private neighborhood. Just farmland stretching for miles. The bridge existed long before any HOA resident ever crossed it. That fact alone completely destroyed the board's claim that the bridge somehow belonged to the neighborhood. But what I discovered next was even more surprising. Buried inside an old property file was a legal agreement signed nearly 20 years earlier. At first glance the document looked insignificant. But as I continued reading, my heart started beating faster. The agreement allowed residents of the future subdivision to use the bridge. However, there was a condition attached to that permission. The community was expected to contribute toward maintenance and repairs whenever major structural work became necessary. I read the paragraph twice just to make sure I wasn't misunderstanding it. The language was crystal clear. The homeowners association had never owned the bridge. Instead, they had been granted access in exchange for helping maintain it. That arrangement seemed perfectly reasonable. The problem was that according to county records there was no evidence the HOA had contributed a single dollar toward maintenance for years. Somehow the original agreement had been forgotten. Or perhaps someone wanted it forgotten. The county clerk helped me trace maintenance records connected to the bridge. The results were unbelievable. Over the past 15 years, every major repair had been funded either by the previous landowner or by private contractors hired directly by him. Meanwhile, the HOA continued benefiting from the structure every single day. There were records showing repairs after storms, repairs after flooding, repairs involving damaged support beams, even resurfacing work performed several years earlier. The total cost over time was substantial. Yet nowhere could we find evidence of financial contributions from the homeowners association. The more records we uncovered, the clearer the picture became. The bridge wasn't simply being used by the HOA. The HOA had been enjoying a valuable asset for years while avoiding responsibilities tied to it. Suddenly Linda's demands made a lot more sense. If residents discovered the truth, they might start asking difficult questions. As I prepared to leave the county office, the clerk mentioned one final detail. Several years earlier, the HOA board had attempted to petition the county for ownership of the bridge. The request had been denied. According to official notes, the county determined that private ownership was already established and legally documented. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. That meant the board already knew they didn't own the bridge. At some point they had actually tried to acquire it. And when that failed, they apparently continued behaving as though ownership didn't matter. The revelation changed everything. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't confusion caused by old paperwork. At least some members of HOA leadership had known the truth for years. Yet they continued allowing residents to believe the bridge belonged to the community. The situation was beginning to look less like ignorance and more like deliberate deception. That evening I sat on my farmhouse porch watching the sun disappear beyond the fields. The bridge was visible in the distance. Cars continued crossing it every few minutes. Families returning home. Delivery drivers finishing routes. Residents completely unaware of the controversy surrounding the structure beneath their wheels. For the first time I started feeling less frustrated with the homeowners and more concerned about them. Most people living inside Willow Creek Estates probably had no idea what was happening. They trusted the board to act in their best interests. They trusted HOA leadership to be honest. But based on everything I had discovered, that trust might not be deserved. I knew one thing for certain. Before this situation ended, the truth was eventually going to come out. And when it did, some people were going to be very unhappy. What I didn't realize was that the next move wouldn't come from me. It would come from Linda. and it would escalate the conflict faster than I ever expected. 3 days after uncovering the truth about the bridge, I received a certified letter from the HOA. The thick envelope was waiting inside my mailbox when I returned from checking fence lines near the southern pasture. At first I assumed it might be an attempt to open negotiations. Maybe someone on the board had reviewed the documents and realized a mistake had been made. I couldn't have been more wrong. The letter contained a formal notice accusing me of negatively affecting neighborhood property values. According to the board, my barns were visually unappealing. My farm equipment created an industrial appearance. And my livestock operations were supposedly inconsistent with the standards expected by Willow Creek Estates. I actually laughed while reading it. The HOA community hadn't even existed when most of those structures were built. My property wasn't part of the HOA. I had never agreed to their rules. Yet somehow they were sending official notices as though they possessed authority over land they didn't own. The more I read the letter, the clearer their strategy became. They weren't trying to solve problems. They were trying to pressure me. And pressure only works when the other side is willing to be intimidated. I wasn't. Later that evening I carefully reviewed every page included with the notice. The board had attached photographs of my property. Some images showed tractors parked near equipment sheds. Others focused on hay storage areas and livestock fencing. The strangest part was that many of the photos appeared to have been taken from inside the HOA neighborhood itself. That meant someone had deliberately spent time documenting my land. The entire situation felt increasingly personal. One page demanded that I repaint 2 barns within 60 days. Another suggested planting trees to block views from certain luxury homes. A third section recommended relocating equipment storage areas farther away from the community. I couldn't believe what I was reading. The requests would cost tens of thousands of dollars. And all of them were being made by people with absolutely no legal authority over my property. For the first time I began wondering how many other landowners had been bullied into compliance before me. The next morning I forwarded the entire package to my attorney. Within a few hours he called me back. His reaction was immediate. He couldn't understand why the HOA believed the notice carried any legal weight. After reviewing the documents, he confirmed exactly what I already suspected. The board had no authority to enforce rules on land located outside their community. They couldn't issue fines. They couldn't require compliance. And they certainly couldn't dictate how I managed thousands of acres of private property. My attorney advised me to keep detailed records of every interaction moving forward. At the time I wasn't sure why he emphasized that point so strongly. Then he said something that caught my attention. In situations like this, organizations sometimes become more aggressive when they realize they don't have legal leverage. That prediction turned out to be frighteningly accurate. Because less than a week later the conflict escalated again. A few days later I noticed several unfamiliar vehicles parked near the bridge. At first I assumed they belonged to utility workers. But when I drove closer I realized something unusual was happening. Members of the HOA board were gathered near the entrance. Portable signs had been installed beside the roadway. One sign warned drivers about possible safety concerns involving the bridge. Another suggested structural inspections might soon be required. The message was obvious. They were attempting to create uncertainty. The problem was that none of the claims appeared to be supported by evidence. I had already reviewed inspection reports. The bridge was safe. It was functional. And there were no known structural concerns. As I watched residents drive past the signs, many looked confused. Some slowed down to read them. Others stopped entirely. Questions were beginning to spread through the neighborhood. And once questions start spreading, it becomes much harder to control the story. That evening my phone started ringing. The first call came from a homeowner who had somehow obtained my number. Then another resident called. And another. Within hours several people from Willow Creek Estates had contacted me directly. Most of them were polite. Many sounded genuinely confused. They wanted to know whether the bridge was actually unsafe. They wanted to know whether ownership disputes were real. Most importantly, they wanted to know why the HOA board seemed unwilling to answer basic questions. For the first time, I realized the situation was no longer limited to a disagreement between me and Linda. Residents were becoming involved. And the more they learned, the more concerned they seemed. By midnight, I had spoken with half a dozen homeowners. Every conversation revealed the same thing. The people living inside the neighborhood had been told a very different version of events. And sooner or later, those conflicting stories were going to collide. When they did, the fallout would be impossible for the board to contain. By the end of the week, the atmosphere inside Willow Creek Estates had completely changed. What started as a quiet disagreement about bridge ownership was now becoming the main topic of conversation throughout the neighborhood. Residents discussed it while walking their dogs. They talked about it during community events. Even local social media groups were filled with questions. Most homeowners weren't interested in taking sides. They simply wanted answers. Why was the HOA demanding money from someone who didn't belong to the association? Why had ownership records never been mentioned before? And perhaps most importantly, why had the board installed warning signs near the bridge if there was no evidence the structure was unsafe? Those questions placed enormous pressure on Linda and the HOA board. For years, residents had trusted their leadership without hesitation. Now that trust was beginning to crack. And once trust starts disappearing, it becomes extremely difficult to rebuild. The board could have resolved the situation by being transparent. Instead, they chose a very different approach. One that would eventually make things much worse. A few days later, every homeowner received an email from the HOA board. The message was carefully written. At first glance, it appeared professional and reassuring. But after reading it closely, I noticed something interesting. The email never directly addressed the ownership records. It never explained the maintenance agreement. It never mentioned the denied county petition. Instead, the board focused entirely on protecting community interests. They described the situation as a dispute involving a neighboring landowner. They suggested misinformation was being spread. And they encouraged residents to trust HOA leadership. Several homeowners forwarded the email to me. Many were frustrated. Others were confused. The message seemed designed to avoid difficult questions rather than answer them. Ironically, the email had the exact opposite effect. Instead of calming residents, it created even more suspicion. People started wondering why the board refused to discuss specific facts. And the more they wondered, the more attention the story received. Then came the announcement everyone had been waiting for. The HOA scheduled a special community meeting to discuss concerns related to the bridge. Attendance was expected to be high. According to several residents, nearly the entire neighborhood planned to show up. Word spread quickly. People wanted explanations. They wanted transparency. Most of all, they wanted honesty. The evening of the meeting, the parking lot filled faster than anyone expected. Vehicles lined both sides of nearby streets. Homeowners packed into the clubhouse conference room. Some residents even stood along the walls because every chair had been taken. The atmosphere felt completely different from the first HOA meeting I attended. Back then, people had listened quietly. This time, frustration was already visible before the meeting even started. The board members knew they were walking into a difficult situation. But I don't think they fully understood just how difficult it was about to become. When Linda finally stepped to the microphone, the room became silent. She began with prepared remarks. The speech focused on protecting property values, maintaining neighborhood standards, preserving community quality of life. For several minutes, nobody interrupted. Then a homeowner in the second row raised his hand. His question was simple. Does the bridge belong to the HOA? The room immediately became quiet. Linda hesitated. It wasn't a long pause. But it was long enough for everyone to notice. Instead of giving a direct answer, she began talking about historical community use. Another homeowner stood up. Then another. Soon, multiple residents were asking variations of the same question. Who owns the bridge? Why wasn't the maintenance agreement disclosed? Why did county records show private ownership? For the first time since this conflict began, the board was facing direct public scrutiny. And they clearly weren't prepared for it. The turning point came from someone nobody expected. An elderly homeowner stood near the back of the room and asked to speak. According to several residents, he had lived in the neighborhood longer than almost anyone else. When the room became quiet, he shared a memory. He recalled discussions from years earlier about bridge maintenance responsibilities. He remembered hearing that the community was supposed to help pay for major repairs. Several longtime residents nodded in agreement. The reaction was immediate. Suddenly, people weren't debating rumors anymore. Multiple homeowners were independently confirming pieces of the same story. You could almost feel the atmosphere changing. Residents began looking toward the board for explanations. Not assumptions. Not opinions. Explanations. For the first time, Linda appeared genuinely concerned. Because once residents start comparing memories with official statements, inconsistencies become impossible to hide. And hidden inconsistencies were exactly what the board needed to avoid. The problem was that the truth was beginning to surface faster than they could control it. The morning after the community meeting, the neighborhood was buzzing with speculation. For years, most residents had rarely questioned HOA leadership. Monthly meetings were usually short. Budgets were approved with little discussion. Board recommendations were accepted without much resistance. That was no longer the case. Homeowners who had never attended meetings before suddenly wanted answers. Residents began reviewing old newsletters, archived emails, and annual budget reports. Several homeowners formed an informal group dedicated to researching the bridge issue. At first, they expected to find a simple misunderstanding. Instead, they discovered something troubling. Year after year, the HOA budget included categories for infrastructure planning and community access improvements. Yet very little information explained where those funds were actually being spent. The discovery raised new questions. Questions the board wasn't prepared to answer. Meanwhile, I continued receiving calls from residents. Many sounded frustrated. Others sounded betrayed. The bridge was no longer the only issue being discussed. People were starting to wonder what else they didn't know. A week later, one homeowner contacted me with information that changed everything. She had been organizing old HOA paperwork stored in her garage. Her husband had previously served on a community committee years earlier and had kept boxes of documents. Most of the material seemed ordinary. Meeting notes, community newsletters, vendor contracts. Then she found a folder labeled Bridge Maintenance. Inside were copies of invoices dating back nearly a decade. As she reviewed the paperwork, something immediately stood out. Several invoices referenced discussions about cost-sharing responsibilities between the HOA and neighboring landowners. The language matched what I had already discovered in county records. The maintenance agreement hadn't been forgotten. At least some members of the HOA knew it existed. Evidence of that knowledge had been sitting inside community records the entire time. When the homeowners shared copies with other residents, the reaction was explosive. People weren't dealing with rumors anymore. Now they had documentation. And documents are much harder to dismiss. As pressure increased, cracks began appearing inside the HOA board itself. Board members who had previously presented a united front started distancing themselves from the controversy. Some claimed they had never seen the maintenance agreement. Others suggested previous administrations were responsible. A few quietly stopped defending Linda altogether. Residents noticed the change immediately. At one meeting, a board member openly stated that he had only recently learned about certain historical records. The comment created visible tension at the front table. Linda's expression changed instantly. For a brief moment, it looked as though she couldn't believe what she had just heard. The board wasn't simply facing pressure from residents anymore. Internal disagreements were beginning to surface. And internal conflicts are often far more dangerous than outside criticism. Because once leaders start contradicting one another, public confidence disappears very quickly. With support slipping away, Linda decided to change strategies. Instead of defending the board's actions, she began focusing attention on me. According to several residents, she claimed I was creating conflict for personal gain. She suggested I was trying to pressure the HOA into financial concessions. She implied that I wanted special treatment. The accusations didn't make much sense. I had never demanded money. I had never restricted access to the bridge. And I had repeatedly offered reasonable solutions. Still, the campaign continued. The problem for Linda was that facts kept getting in the way. Every time residents reviewed documents, they found evidence supporting the same conclusion. The bridge belonged to my property. The HOA had maintenance obligations. And leadership had failed to communicate that reality honestly. The more she attacked my credibility, the more residents focused on verifying information for themselves. Ironically, her strategy accelerated the very outcome she was trying to prevent. Then came the revelation that truly shook the neighborhood. During a resident-led review of past financial reports, several homeowners discovered references to bridge-related reserve funds. The entries appeared in multiple annual budgets. Money had been allocated. Money had been collected. But according to maintenance records, very little of that funding had ever been used for the bridge itself. The discovery triggered immediate concern. Residents wanted to know where the funds had gone. They wanted detailed accounting. They wanted transparency. What had started as a disagreement over bridge ownership was rapidly evolving into something much larger. Now questions involved finances, governance, and accountability. The board suddenly found itself under scrutiny from every direction. As word spread through the community, the atmosphere changed once again. People weren't simply frustrated anymore. They were angry. And when homeowners start demanding answers about money, the situation can escalate faster than anyone expects. For the first time since buying the property, I realized the bridge might not be the biggest problem facing Willow Creek Estates. It might only be the beginning. The financial questions spreading through Willow Creek Estates refused to disappear. What began as casual conversations between neighbors quickly transformed into organized action. Residents weren't satisfied with vague explanations anymore. They wanted records. They wanted documentation. Most importantly, they wanted accountability. Within days, a petition began circulating throughout the community. Homeowners signed it at neighborhood gatherings. They signed it during community events. They signed it online. The purpose was simple. Residents wanted an independent audit of HOA finances. The request wasn't unreasonable. Thousands of dollars in bridge-related reserve funds appeared throughout past budgets. Yet nobody could clearly explain how those funds had been used. The petition gained momentum far faster than anyone expected. Even homeowners who normally avoided HOA politics joined the effort. Many felt they had been paying fees for years without receiving clear information about where the money went. For the first time in the association's history, leadership was facing widespread demands for financial transparency. And there was no easy way to ignore them. The bridge dispute had evolved into a community-wide trust crisis. As pressure mounted, the HOA board announced an emergency meeting. The notice described the event as an opportunity to address community concerns. Residents interpreted it differently. Many believed leadership was finally being forced to answer difficult questions. Attendance shattered previous records. People arrived early. Parking spaces filled almost immediately. Additional chairs had to be brought into the clubhouse. The atmosphere felt completely different from earlier meetings. This wasn't curiosity anymore. It was frustration. When the meeting finally began, residents wasted no time. Questions came from every direction. Where were the reserve funds? Who approved bridge-related expenditures? Why had ownership records never been disclosed? Several board members looked visibly uncomfortable. Some avoided eye contact altogether. Others quietly reviewed documents while residents spoke. The pressure inside the room continued building. And with every unanswered question, confidence in HOA leadership slipped a little further. During the meeting, an unexpected development changed the entire conversation. One resident revealed that he had spoken with a local reporter covering community issues in the region. At first, the information didn't seem important. Then several homeowners began discussing media attention openly. The room immediately reacted. For years, HOA disagreements had remained private. Now there was a possibility the story could become public. Residents weren't necessarily seeking publicity. Many simply believed outside attention might encourage transparency. Board members clearly viewed the situation differently. The possibility of journalists examining HOA records created visible concern. Suddenly, leadership wasn't only dealing with homeowners. They were facing the possibility of outside scrutiny as well. The bridge ownership dispute had already damaged trust. Public attention could potentially damage the HOA's reputation far beyond the neighborhood itself. And everyone in the room understood that. Especially Linda. Over the following weeks, support for Linda continued shrinking. Homeowners who had previously defended the board became noticeably quieter. Several committee volunteers resigned from advisory positions. Even some longtime supporters began asking difficult questions. The most significant change came from within the board itself. One member publicly recommended cooperating with an independent financial review. Another suggested releasing historical maintenance records to residents. The recommendations sounded reasonable. Unfortunately, they also contradicted Linda's strategy. For months she had treated the situation as a challenge to HOA authority. Other board members increasingly viewed it as a transparency problem. The disagreement became impossible to hide. Residents noticed it immediately. Every public meeting revealed more tension. Every discussion exposed new differences. Leadership no longer appeared united. And without unity, the board's ability to control the narrative weakened dramatically. The foundation beneath Linda's position was beginning to crack. The breaking point arrived during a special vote requested by homeowners. The proposal itself wasn't extreme. Residents simply wanted an independent review of financial records related to bridge maintenance and reserve funds. Yet the vote carried enormous symbolic importance. It represented the community's confidence in leadership. Or lack of it. As ballots were counted, the room remained silent. Homeowners watched carefully. Board members exchanged nervous glances. When the final result was announced, a wave of reactions spread through the crowd. The proposal passed by a substantial margin. Residents had spoken clearly. They wanted answers. They wanted transparency. And they were no longer willing to accept vague explanations. For Linda, the result was devastating. While she technically remained HOA president, her authority had been weakened significantly. The community had effectively chosen oversight over trust. As people left the meeting that night, one thing became obvious. The battle over the bridge had entered an entirely new phase. What happened next would determine not only the future of the HOA board but possibly the future of the entire association itself. 2 weeks after the community vote, the independent audit officially began. The accounting firm hired by the homeowners had no connection to the HOA board and no reason to favor either side. Their job was simple. Follow the money. Review the records. Report the facts. At first, most residents expected the audit to confirm a few bookkeeping mistakes. Nothing more. But as auditors started reviewing years of financial documents, they requested additional records. Then more records. Then even more. The requests became increasingly specific. Bank statements. Vendor invoices. Reserve fund reports. Maintenance contracts. Meeting minutes. The deeper they looked, the more questions seemed to emerge. Inside Willow Creek Estates, rumors spread rapidly. Some residents believed the audit would clear everything up. Others feared it might reveal serious problems. Meanwhile, Linda publicly insisted the board had nothing to worry about. She encouraged residents to remain patient and trust the process. But despite her confident statements, something about her behavior had changed. She seemed more defensive. More cautious. More concerned. For the first time since this conflict began, it looked like she realized the situation might be slipping beyond her control. While the auditors worked behind the scenes, I focused on something else. The bridge itself. For months it had been at the center of every argument, every meeting, and every controversy. Yet despite all the discussion, very few people had actually examined its condition. I hired a structural engineer to perform a complete inspection. The goal wasn't political. It wasn't strategic. I simply wanted accurate information. A week later, the engineer delivered his report. The bridge was safe. The structure remained solid. However, several preventative maintenance projects would eventually be needed within the next few years. Nothing urgent. Nothing dangerous. Just responsible upkeep. The findings completely contradicted the warning signs previously installed by the HOA. Residents who reviewed the report immediately noticed the difference. For months they had been told the bridge might be unsafe. Now an independent engineer was saying the opposite. Trust in HOA leadership continued declining. And every new fact seemed to strengthen the same conclusion. The problem had never been the bridge. The problem was transparency. Then came the audit's preliminary findings. Although the final report wasn't complete, several key observations were shared with the community. The announcement created immediate shock. According to auditors, multiple financial records contained inconsistencies. Certain expenditures lacked sufficient documentation. Several reserve fund transfers required additional explanation. Most importantly, bridge-related budget allocations appeared repeatedly throughout historical records despite limited evidence showing corresponding expenses. The findings didn't accuse anyone of wrongdoing, but they raised serious concerns. Concerns residents could no longer ignore. The reaction throughout the neighborhood was immediate. Community forums exploded with discussion. Homeowners exchanged emails late into the night. Many residents felt betrayed. Others felt embarrassed for trusting leadership without asking more questions. The atmosphere inside Willow Creek Estates became increasingly tense. And the final audit report still hadn't been released. Everyone knew the biggest revelations might still be ahead. The proposal itself wasn't extreme. Residents simply wanted an independent review of financial records related to bridge maintenance and reserve funds. Yet the vote carried enormous symbolic importance. It represented the community's confidence in leadership. Or lack of it. As ballots were counted, the room remained silent. Homeowners watched carefully. Board members exchanged nervous glances. When the final result was announced, a wave of reactions spread through the crowd. The proposal passed by a substantial margin. Residents had spoken clearly. They wanted answers. They wanted transparency. And they were no longer willing to accept vague explanations. For Linda, the result was devastating. While she technically remained HOA president, her authority had been weakened significantly. The community had effectively chosen oversight over trust. As people left the meeting that night, one thing became obvious. The battle over the bridge had entered an entirely new phase. What happened next would determine not only the future of the HOA board but possibly the future of the entire association itself. 2 weeks after the community vote, the independent audit officially began. The accounting firm hired by the homeowners had no connection to the HOA board and no reason to favor either side. Their job was simple. Follow the money. Review the records. Report the facts. At first, most residents expected the audit to confirm a few bookkeeping mistakes. Nothing more. But as auditors started reviewing years of financial documents, they requested additional records. Then more records. Then even more. The requests became increasingly specific. Bank statements. Vendor invoices. Reserve fund reports. Maintenance contracts. Meeting minutes. The deeper they looked, the more questions seemed to emerge. Inside Willow Creek Estates, rumors spread rapidly. Some residents believed the audit would clear everything up. Others feared it might reveal serious problems. Meanwhile, Linda publicly insisted the board had nothing to worry about. She encouraged residents to remain patient and trust the process. But despite her confident statements, something about her behavior had changed. She seemed more defensive. More cautious. More concerned. For the first time since this conflict began, it looked like she realized the situation might be slipping beyond her control. While the auditors worked behind the scenes, I focused on something else. The bridge itself. For months it had been at the center of every argument, every meeting, and every controversy. Yet despite all the discussion, very few people had actually examined its condition. I hired a structural engineer to perform a complete inspection. The goal wasn't political. It wasn't strategic. I simply wanted accurate information. A week later, the engineer delivered his report. The bridge was safe. The structure remained solid. However, several preventative maintenance projects would eventually be needed within the next few years. Nothing urgent. Nothing dangerous. Just responsible upkeep. The findings completely contradicted the warning signs previously installed by the HOA. Residents who reviewed the report immediately noticed the difference. For months they had been told the bridge might be unsafe. Now an independent engineer was saying the opposite. Trust in HOA leadership continued declining. And every new fact seemed to strengthen the same conclusion. The problem had never been the bridge. The problem was transparency. Then came the audit's preliminary findings. Although the final report wasn't complete, several key observations were shared with the community. The announcement created immediate shock. According to auditors, multiple financial records contained inconsistencies. Certain expenditures lacked sufficient documentation. Several reserve fund transfers required additional explanation. Most importantly, bridge-related budget allocations appeared repeatedly throughout historical records despite limited evidence showing corresponding expenses. The findings didn't accuse anyone of wrongdoing, but they raised serious concerns. Concerns residents could no longer ignore. The reaction throughout the neighborhood was immediate. Community forums exploded with discussion. Homeowners exchanged emails late into the night. Many residents felt betrayed. Others felt embarrassed for trusting leadership without asking more questions. The atmosphere inside Willow Creek Estates became increasingly tense. And the final audit report still hadn't been released. Everyone knew the biggest revelations might still be ahead. Facing growing criticism, Linda made one final attempt to regain control of the narrative. She organized a community presentation intended to restore confidence in the board. Residents packed the clubhouse once again. The event began with carefully prepared slides highlighting neighborhood improvements completed over the years. Landscaping projects, security upgrades, community amenities. For a short time the presentation seemed effective. Then the questions started. A homeowner asked about bridge reserve funds. Another requested clarification regarding maintenance agreements. Someone else referenced audit findings. Within minutes the discussion shifted away from accomplishments and back toward accountability. The presentation quickly unraveled. Every answer seemed to generate two new questions. Every explanation created additional confusion. By the end of the evening it was obvious the strategy had failed. Residents no longer wanted public relations. They wanted facts. And facts were becoming increasingly difficult to avoid. The turning point arrived only days later. The accounting firm released its final audit report. Homeowners received digital copies early that morning. By lunchtime, nearly everyone in the community had read at least part of it. The report contained hundreds of pages. Financial summaries, supporting documents, historical records, detailed analysis. But one conclusion stood above everything else. The auditors confirmed that bridge-related funds had repeatedly appeared in HOA budgets over many years. They also confirmed significant gaps in documentation regarding how portions of those funds were managed. The findings triggered an immediate response from residents. Calls for accountability grew louder. Demands for leadership changes spread quickly. For the first time in Willow Creek Estates history, homeowners openly discussed replacing board members, including the president. As I watched events unfold from my farmhouse porch, I realized something remarkable. Months earlier, I had simply purchased a piece of land. I never intended to challenge an HOA. I never intended to become involved in community politics. Yet a single bridge had exposed problems nobody expected to find. And the biggest consequences were still coming. Because after the audit, residents would soon demand something even more powerful than explanations. They would demand change. The audit report changed everything. Within 48 hours of its release, homeowners began organizing in ways nobody had seen before. Residents who had rarely attended meetings were suddenly participating in community discussions every day. Neighborhood social media groups became extremely active. Emails circulated throughout the community. Homeowners met in living rooms, driveways, and coffee shops discussing the future of Willow Creek Estates. The conversation was no longer about the bridge. The bridge had simply exposed deeper problems. Now residents were talking about accountability, trust, and leadership. A growing number of homeowners believed the board had lost credibility. Some wanted reforms. Others wanted resignations. Many wanted both. Then someone proposed a formal recall effort. At first, the idea seemed unrealistic. Removing HOA leadership was a serious step. But as support continued growing, it became clear that frustration had reached a level few people anticipated. The community wasn't looking for promises anymore. They were looking for change. And for the first time since this entire situation began, it seemed possible that change was actually coming. As the recall movement gained momentum, pressure inside the HOA board became unbearable. Several members found themselves caught between angry residents and increasingly difficult questions. One board member resigned unexpectedly. The official statement cited personal reasons. Very few homeowners believed that explanation. A second resignation followed only days later. Then a committee chair stepped down as well. Each departure weakened confidence in leadership even further. Residents interpreted the resignations as confirmation that serious problems existed behind the scenes. The board that once appeared powerful and united now looked fragile and divided. Meanwhile, Linda attempted to maintain control. She continued issuing statements. She continued defending past decisions. But every public appearance seemed to make the situation worse. The community had already moved beyond explanations. Homeowners wanted accountability. And accountability was becoming impossible to avoid. The structure of HOA leadership was beginning to collapse from within. A special homeowners meeting was scheduled to discuss the future of the association. Attendance broke every previous record. Residents filled the clubhouse long before the meeting began. Some stood along walls. Others listened from overflow areas. The atmosphere felt historic. Everyone knew important decisions were about to be made. When discussions started, homeowners spoke openly. Many described losing trust in HOA leadership. Others expressed frustration over years of limited transparency. Several residents referenced the bridge dispute as the moment they realized something wasn't right. Speaker after speaker delivered the same message. The community needed a fresh start. Not because people wanted conflict, but because trust once broken cannot be repaired through words alone. By the end of the evening, one conclusion had become unavoidable. The residents were no longer following the board. The board was now reacting to the residents. Power inside Willow Creek Estates had shifted dramatically. Less than a week later, emergency elections were officially announced. The decision marked one of the most significant moments in the history of the community. For years, leadership positions had often been filled with little competition. Now multiple homeowners stepped forward as candidates. Many campaigned on transparency, financial accountability, community involvement, and improved relationships with neighboring property owners. The contrast couldn't have been clearer. Residents weren't simply choosing new board members. They were choosing a different direction for the entire neighborhood. As election preparations continued, something unexpected happened. Several candidates reached out to me directly. Not to argue, not to make demands, but to apologize. They acknowledged that the bridge dispute had never been handled properly. They admitted mistakes had been made. And they expressed hope that future relationships could be built on mutual respect instead of confrontation. For the first time since buying the property, I felt genuine optimism. Then came a moment I never expected to witness. One afternoon, a small group of HOA representatives arrived at my ranch. The atmosphere felt completely different from my first meeting with Linda. There were no demands, no threats, no assumptions. Instead, they carried folders containing proposals. The representatives explained that residents wanted to move forward constructively. They wanted a fair maintenance agreement. They wanted long-term access to the bridge. Most importantly, they wanted a respectful relationship with neighboring landowners. For nearly 2 hours, we discussed practical solutions. Every conversation remained professional. Every proposal focused on cooperation. As the meeting ended, I couldn't help thinking about how much had changed. Months earlier, the HOA viewed the bridge as something they could control. Now they understood it was something they needed to respect. The conflict that started with entitlement was finally evolving into cooperation. But one final chapter still remained. Because before this story could truly end, the community would need to decide who would lead it into the future. Election day arrived with a level of participation nobody in Willow Creek Estates had ever seen before. From early morning until late afternoon, residents streamed into the clubhouse to cast their votes. Many homeowners who had never participated in HOA elections before made a point of showing up. The atmosphere throughout the neighborhood felt almost historic. People weren't simply selecting board members. They were deciding what kind of community they wanted moving forward. For months, the bridge controversy had dominated conversations. Families discussed it over dinner. Neighbors discussed it during walks. Residents discussed it at every community gathering. Now everyone understood that the election represented something larger than a disagreement over property rights. It represented trust, transparency, accountability. As voting continued, many homeowners reflected on how dramatically things had changed. Only a few months earlier, most residents assumed everything was functioning normally. Now they understood how important community oversight really was. By sunset, anticipation filled the neighborhood. Everyone waited for the results. And everyone knew those results would shape the future of Willow Creek Estates for years to come. The vote count lasted well into the evening. Residents gathered inside the clubhouse while others waited outside discussing predictions and possibilities. As results were announced, one thing became immediately clear. The community wanted change. Multiple incumbent board members lost their positions. Several reform candidates won by substantial margins. Candidates who had promised transparency and accountability received overwhelming support. Then came the announcement everyone had been waiting for. Linda would not be returning as HOA president. The room fell silent for a moment. Not because residents hated her. Not because people wanted revenge. But because everyone understood they were witnessing the end of an era. For years she had been one of the most influential figures in the neighborhood. Now the community had chosen a different path. Some residents applauded. Others simply nodded quietly. The election wasn't about celebrating someone's defeat. It was about rebuilding trust. And rebuilding trust required new leadership. For the first time in months, many homeowners felt optimistic about the future. A few weeks later, the newly elected board invited me to attend one of their first official meetings. The difference was obvious from the moment I entered the room. The atmosphere felt professional, collaborative, respectful. Instead of demands, the conversation focused on solutions. Instead of assumptions, the discussion focused on facts. Board members reviewed bridge maintenance requirements. They reviewed engineering reports. They reviewed historical agreements. Most importantly, they listened. Together we worked through details that should have been addressed years earlier. The process wasn't complicated. In fact, it was surprisingly straightforward. Once everyone agreed to focus on reality rather than politics, practical solutions emerged quickly. The new board proposed a formal maintenance partnership. The agreement would protect bridge access for residents while ensuring costs were shared fairly. For the first time since buying the property, I felt like I was working with neighbors instead of adversaries. And that made all the difference. The final agreement was signed on a bright spring morning beside the bridge that had started everything. Residents gathered nearby. Several board members attended. Even county officials stopped by to observe the occasion. The document established long-term access rights for the HOA community. It also created a fair maintenance schedule shared between both parties. Everyone involved understood the significance of the moment. The bridge would remain open. The community would continue thriving. And future conflicts would be far less likely. As signatures were placed on the final pages, I looked across the creek toward Willow Creek Estates. Months earlier, that view represented conflict, frustration, and uncertainty. Now it represented cooperation. The bridge itself hadn't changed. The wood was the same. The steel supports were the same. The water flowing beneath it was the same. What changed were the people. And sometimes that's what matters most. Looking back, the strangest part of this entire story isn't that I bought 6,000 acres of land. It isn't that I unknowingly became owner of the only bridge connecting an entire HOA community to the outside world. And it isn't even the months of conflict that followed. The strangest part is how a simple piece of infrastructure exposed problems nobody expected to find. A bridge doesn't care about politics. It doesn't care about titles. It doesn't care who sits on a board or who wins an election. A bridge simply connects people. For a long time, the residents of Willow Creek Estates believed the bridge belonged to them. When they discovered the truth, many felt shocked. Some felt angry. Others felt betrayed. But ultimately, that truth forced the community to confront larger issues involving trust, accountability, and responsibility. In the end, nobody lost access to the bridge. Nobody lost their homes. Nobody lost their community. Instead, the neighborhood gained something far more valuable: a fresh start. As the sun set over the fields that evening, I stood beside the bridge watching cars cross peacefully across the creek. Families headed home. Children laughed from back seats. Life moved forward. And for the first time since buying the property, everything felt exactly the way it should.